Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's my pleasure today to be here with Frank Rodriguez, who is the policy advocate for CAUSE. And I'm going to let him talk about CAUSE in a second, but I want to just give you a welcome, warm introduction because you, Frank, are somebody who's a tremendous activist in this community. You do so much work in this community for people who don't have a whole lot of representation and aren't able to navigate what's happening at City Hall. You're their voice. You're doing so much, a lot of it behind the scenes. Sometimes you get headlines with some of the work you do when you intersect with government, but you are somebody who is really important and powerful and making a difference. And I'm so glad that you were able to be on this show today. Take some time in your very busy schedule. How are you today, Frank?
Good. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me and appreciate the kind words.
Yeah, thank you. I want to dive right in and talk to you about an issue that's coming up Tuesday at Santa Barbara City Hall. And this is the rent control / stabilization. I know there's some different terms going around for what it is, but I want to talk to you about why Santa Barbara is having this conversation and what CAUSE's position is as it relates to implementing some kind of stabilization of rising rents in the city. We obviously know that there's a large Latino population that has been slowly leaving and been driven out because of increasing rents. Your organization's done a lot of that research. Talk to me about rent control, rent stabilization, Frank. Why do we need it?
Yeah, so thanks again and again, Frank Rodriguez, policy advocate with CAUSE. And just to give a little context with CAUSE, I think it helps answer this question and why we approach the way we do our work. CAUSE works on building a base of community leaders, especially immigrant moms and pops in the east side and west side of Santa Barbara. These areas that, we've traditionally have a lot of below market rent many times, a lot of places where a lot of the service workers, the hotel workers, a lot of that service industry that Santa Barbara really depends on lives in these communities. And CAUSE has been around since the living wage campaigns in the early 2000s. And so around 5, 6, 7 years ago now, our community leaders, especially in the west side of Santa Barbara, mostly single immigrant parents and moms, were being evicted unjustly or were being evicted without cause. They weren't told the reason. And so as CAUSE, we were having meetings. During that time, Rigo was the community organizer with CAUSE here in Santa Barbara. And I remember attending one of those meetings where folks had just been evicted. They appreciated, I think, very much the immigrant rights work that was really the focus of our work during that time, especially in terms of cars that were being confiscated from individuals when they were pulled over if they didn't have a license. And during that whole era of fear around that issue. But these moms were telling us, like, the biggest issue we have is these evictions. We are seeing our community being displaced, and that was that emergency that forced them to move out of Santa Barbara, and many times not leave the job in Santa Barbara, just move to another neighboring city or area where they can live. And so that's why around 5 years ago, CAUSE took on housing issues as one of our top issues to address really the gentrification that we first felt, very much so here in Santa Barbara, but something that was a reality as well in the other cities we work on, which was in Santa Maria and Oxnard and Ventura and Santa Paula. And so during that time, we saw that this displacement was one of the main issues we needed to tackle. And so with our community leaders, really went into advocating for tenant protections. And I think to close that loop, we were looking at what many of our statewide activists like Tenants Together, an activist group that was with us in our latest protest and has been supporting a lot of the rent stabilization, rent control efforts that have been happening across the state. Leading with the message of we need eviction protections alongside rent stabilization and habitability enforcement. That kind of tenant protection triangle works because that way folks cannot be displaced because a unit is uninhabitable that they have to leave. Someone just evicted without reason, and or the rents are raised to a point where they can't live there no more. So that kind of protection for us is an important safety net. And so why we have been advocating for rent stabilization so that folks can plan for these increases in cost of housing. Because we know the majority of our community is rent burdened, especially here in Santa Barbara County, but the despairing kind of wages and the cost of living here. So as Cause, we really took it on to do this fight with our coalition partners, especially labor unions, especially other groups, because we know, although we're definitely advocating for the Spanish-speaking immigrant community, this fight is for everybody in terms of this is going to benefit and put a safety net. So it's protecting everyone from the bottom that protects everyone above that. We appreciate the Santa Barbara City Council, and this has been, and we also appreciate everyone in this effort because this has been a long, critical conversation that we've been having at City Hall, which we appreciate, and we know it's been needed. So appreciated that Just Cause was implemented in Santa Barbara with the strong relocation assistance for folks here in Santa Barbara, knowing that we want to limit that emergency that forces people. Like you opened up, Josh, in talking about the push out of the Latinx community, the push out of people of color, the push out of folks who are part of an economy that was hurt, especially by folks working here during the COVID-19 pandemic, during the ecological disasters we've had here. So I think a lot of that has really opened us to really use that word like safety net. A safety net to make sure that folks don't fall between the cracks. And so that's why we as Cause and as a community have been advocating to close that loophole in tenant protections, which is really how much rents have been increasing over the years. And we know, looking at the South Coast kind of survey that they put out, that since 2012, we've seen a 40% increase in rents, and we know wages haven't been increasing like that. So I know there's a lot of nitty gritty more information, but I'll stop there, right, Josh, in terms of why Cause really with our community leaders has been advocating for rent stabilization.
Yeah. So the last time this issue came up, it was a long meeting, and we had property owners, people from the real estate community, businesses come forward and talk about how it would be the wrong direction for the city to go this way. Now, obviously, we also had plenty of renters and activists and people say, no, we need to do this. So it was well represented on both sides. But can you talk about property owners who say things like, if we have rent stabilization, if we're not allowed to raise rents according to our needs, according to what the market rate will allow, it's actually going to hurt the people that it's trying to help the most, because there's going to be less investment in housing. There's going to be less of an effort to want to maintain these homes because they're not getting that extra money for tenant improvements. And this, they say, depending on who you talk to, these aren't super wealthy people, all of them, or corporations. This might be a property owner in the community that has just a couple properties. And if you lower their ability to take in rent, they do affect them in a real personal way. So can you talk about some of those counter arguments?
Yeah, no, and we know there's several. And for us, we feel it doesn't matter who, what unit we're talking about, right? Because there's definitely different type of units. There's some that we can't even touch, which are limited by Costa-Hawkins, which doesn't allow for new developments or properties built after 1995 to have rent control. So those properties are off the table, right? So in terms of this conversation of it's going to hurt development and that new housing that we know we need, and Cause and our community partners have been at those meetings within the city or within the county advocating for those funds. But in terms of rent stabilization and rent control have been in practice for a very long time, for several decades throughout the state, but of course throughout the country. And that first wave of rent stabilization efforts that saw it come in Los Angeles and the San Francisco kind of metro areas, those cities are still functioning and thriving. And then there's been a new wave with this new housing crisis, and where we're seeing the cities of Santana, we're seeing the cities of Inglewood, and locally the city of Oxnard just voted to support rent stabilization at 4%. Just 2 days ago or yesterday, which is a huge kind of win for the Central Coast as being the first city to take that step to bring rent stabilization into practice. And we know one of the biggest talking points that we've been hearing from property owners has been that the cost of this bureaucratic program is going to be unmanageable. But what Oxnard shows us is what they're charging per unit is $50 a year to manage this program, which is around $4 to $5 a month. Where these costs can be split between the tenant and the landlord. And so that idea that this is going to be too much money spent on a program, the models and the examples that we've had for rent stabilization throughout the state are plentiful. And so we appreciate Oxnard showing that example of a model that is where the city manager takes a big role in making sure that the laws are being fulfilled. So this idea that the program is too costly, just to be open, there's like a lot of folks have been saying, our policy director, Lucas Zucker, has been saying, is there's the Cadillac models, right, that can be very expensive, but there's also kind of the Hondas, right, the Civics that will not be as expensive. And we can't use the fear tactic of just looking at those really expensive models, because we know we have to be unique to our smaller kind of cities that we have here in the Central Coast. So big ups to Oxnard in getting that win and getting 4% into play, and addressing another fear in terms of habitability issue, which we know we've been talking with council members on that in terms of what's going to happen to the habitability. And like I mentioned in our tenant protections triangle, that's a huge part. And anybody that is renting apartments to a community member needs to make sure that they are habitable. We cannot have folks living with mold, something that was talked about at the action we just had, where folks were addressing the uninhabitable housing they've been living in, with paying all these rent increases that have been coming. So rent increases have been coming without habitability being implemented. However, when rent stabilization does get implemented, there is waivers that can be applied to, because someone is still allowed to make their money. So hence why there's an agreement of what that rent increase is over time. But there could be an emergency waiver that someone applies to, let it be with the city manager or the rent control board, whichever one is managing, for them to say, I want to increase rents to this amount because I'm going to be doing these fixes to my property. And those can range in terms of how big they can be, but someone can definitely ask for those emergency waivers in order to implement those habitability. However, now they have to show that they are fixing it in order to ask for that money from the tenants, which is a better power balance for us in thinking that someone right now, right, looking at the average rent, right, it's over $2,000 for any of the bedrooms, and someone is investing in paying that rent all the time, and so they haven't been seeing those fixes coming in. So we feel like what this rent stabilization does, it creates a communication in which both parties understand, one, how much they're contributing, and also not the fear that, you know what, I can get this huge rent increase all of a sudden. And so we feel that the state rent gouging law, that is maybe another example that folks talk about in terms of, oh, we already have something. That rent gouging law is temporary, right? It got put in to be in practice for 10 years. And also that is about rent gouging, not rent stabilization or rent control. So hence why it's at a high percentage of 5% plus CPI. And so we appreciate like what Oxnard just did at 4%. And we've been advocating here in Santa Barbara for a while for 2%. but understand that and open to hear where kind of the negotiations are in terms of really what that percentage is. And do agree that CPI is an important equation of it. So we've also flirted in terms of that idea of 2% or CPI, especially when the CPI is above 2%. But I think really looking at when you look at compound interest and how much rent can increase, and the difference between a 2% rent increase from a 5% and a 10% are huge. So I think it's really important to see those, the effect that rent increases can have on a rental unit throughout a 10-year period. It is important, not just how much they can increase rent each year, because that compound interest can increase very quickly as someone's rent continues to increase, and the percentage, how much that takes in increases as well. So I think it's important for that communication to be very clear between the two parties, and a trend that more and more cities are taking up here in California.
Yeah. Yeah, very well put. Well said. Makes total sense. One other argument, just to get you real quickly to respond to, is, if you have, the properties built in the last 15 years or so, it would not apply. So the older buildings, it would. Would you have scenario where people would never leave because their rent controlled amount of that they have to pay is going to be lower? And so they're just going to stay there forever, even if maybe they get a new job or even if they make more money. Whereas these other new apartments are market rate, and you're going to have sort of two of these divisions in rental apartments in town. I've heard that argument as well. Can you talk about, if you have a rent controlled apartment, does that mean people are going to be there forever and never going to leave, and then we're not going to have turnover and we're going to have a stagnant community?
Yeah, and we totally agree that there's a difference in terms of that really old school rent control, like that New York rent control when it got really first put into hand. In California, we are working with a different environment. You already mentioned one of them with the Costa-Hawkins law that limits what type of units can be can be rent stabilized. And then we also have the Ellis Act. This provides property owners a lot of power in order to take their property outside of the rental market. And we have been advocating to follow what the 2019 Tenants' Rights Act or the Tenants' Protections Act, where they Costa-Hawkins doesn't allow single family homes, so those are out of the question, right? But it allows certain types of rental units, but not a duplex that has an owner that lives in there in one of those two units. And in terms of the just cause language that's in place, it does definitely limit, and it requires someone to say why someone's being evicted. Basically, someone is able to defend themselves in court because they have to be given a reason. But some of those reasons do include a owner move-in. So if a immediate family member is moving back into that property, that is just cause for eviction. Hence the relocation assistance being afforded to them. This is not the same kind of really strong rent control that was in place really when rent control really first started to be implemented. We've had a lot of modifications, and definitely the word and the voice of the property owners have come into play very much so in how rent stabilized properties work in California. I think there's enough kind of rights for folks for those protections, and we still do have those just cause kind of procedures where someone can be evicted from a property if it's just, and if so that they get a relocation assistance to help them move.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, I want to talk to you about a couple things, which is the core issue here. What's happening with Latinos and Latinx community in Santa Barbara? We're seeing them move out of the city. We just did the redistricting, and District 3 has fewer Latinos than it did before since the census count. What's going on in this community? I know you grew up in this community. Can you talk about why it matters that we're losing people who grew up here, why that's meaningful. You're here, you're making it work, but it's difficult and it's tough. What does a community lose when we lose, the Latinx community, people who've grown up in this community? What's the issue here?
No, for sure. Yeah, I grew up, was born in Carthage Hospital, went to Franklin and Cleveland before I went to La Colina, and then over to Bishop Garcia Diego High School, where my family moved more towards the 154 and the 101. And ended up going to Bishop after I worked at La Cumbre Country Club, started at junior high. They sponsored me to go there, but my brother went to San Marcos. So yeah, I grew up in this community and definitely saw a change, especially that lower. I grew up in where Voluntario and Punta Gorda hit, down in the Lower East Side, and that's where we've actually had a lot of actions. When our organizer Alejandra Melgoza was organizing with us, did a few actions where we marched down Voluntario Street, really addressing the felt gentrification. I remember during that time, I had taken some council members. I think it was blanking out right now, but we took them over to some apartments on Voluntario where rents were literally being increased by $400 or $500 on a family who it was a family with two children, and of course, this is before the pandemic, before we had a lot of the protections, and they couldn't understand why they were getting that. And then we looked at the apartment, and all I had gotten was like that white and black paint that we see a lot of places get. But the stairways were still very unsturdy. There was not a lot of fixes, but you saw places basically getting flipped. And I think all that area in Cacique, in Hata Street, all around Voluntario, and these areas that at the end of the day are pretty close to downtown and have really good public transit to get to downtown from the east side and the west side. So that's why we've always had the fear of these areas being primed for kind of flipping properties and getting a different clientele rather than kind of service workers, right? Getting more of the higher income tech workers. And so we wanted to really see these protections be into place, especially in these areas, because we wanted to protect, like I started off talking about, like those kind of below market rent areas that a lot of the workers in the city usually work at, that nowhere is below market rent here, right, anymore, but where folks are still trying to survive. And folks, many times when we talk about the rent increases they get, they're like, cool, I would have been cool to pay this, but over a longer period of time, or at least given better notice of when this was coming, so I can plan my financials in order to take care of this. And so yeah, I think that is very much felt, and especially when I think one of the ones I felt the most was, I think I was talking to some business owners on Meat Bus during kind of las fiestas, and folks just talking about like they feel that the presence of Mexican community and other immigrant communities is really a lot lower. And I think it's important on us to really recognize the history of communities that have been kind of pushed out of Santa Barbara, which include what's going on now, but especially, of course, also the Black community in the 70s and 80s, and that gentrification that took place then, which coincides alongside when the oil crisis was happening. So I think what we really want to see is these safety nets put into place to make sure that folks do not have to be displaced, where families and especially kids don't have to start school all over again in another area, or really look for somewhere else to live. As someone who grew up here, like I want all my family to still be here, right? But there's a lot of ways folks get pushed out. Like my pops is back in Mexico. My uncle was kind of locked up here at county jail, and then he's back in Mexico after being deported by getting handed over to immigration. Two of my tias and a tío moved to Texas during kind of that early 2000s, when a lot of folks wanted to go take money that way to buy a house, right? And so you saw folks that were kind of leaving and being pushed out, and now I can count the amount of family I have here. So I think when we're talking about what it means to keep a community together, I think it's more than just rent stabilization, right? I think there's a lot of factors that go into pushing out especially the immigrant and the people of color population that we've been hearing and seeing in the census, because there's no reason why Santa Barbara's immigrant or Latino population should be around stagnant, while the rest of Southern California, especially Santa Maria and Oxnard, they're increasing rapidly in immigrant population, but not in Santa Barbara. So we've definitely been looking at the census data, especially in the east side and west side. We see in the west side especially, there was a lot of folks pushed out. And so I think there's a lot to comb through the latest census. And it's a fear we've, as you're talking about, that we've had, that we're going to continue to lose the community that, and the historical, like Santa Barbara has been a working class community, right? I think over the ages, it's gotten a lot of fame for a lot of different things, but at the end of the day, it's always had working class folks that have lived in, especially in the east side of Santa Barbara. A lot of people of color, a lot of communities that have brought Santa Barbara to what it is today. And it's gone through many different phases after the earthquake in the 20s, after all the changes. But at the end, it's still kind of a working class community, we feel, and we want to make sure we protect those folks that are really the providing the service and whatever other type of work that makes Santa Barbara run.
Yeah, I went to 5 different elementary schools, and we moved when, they raised the rents, and my parents never owned anything, and we just moved around, I can't even tell you all the streets I've lived on in Goleta and Santa Barbara. I was born in Goleta Valley Cottage Hospital when they called it Goleta Valley. And all my family, I think I'm the last one here. My family's in Lompoc, they're in Santa Maria, all my cousins. And then, there's people all over, that just moved out of California too, and so it's really interesting to watch sort of that migration of people, because they can't afford to live here. And I lived on Cacique for a while there, right by the creek there, and the mobile home parks. And as an adult, I've lived where I live now in Goleta, is the longest I've ever lived anywhere. So hopefully things are stable now. But, you talk like Haley Street, right?
Yeah.
If you walk Haley Street, you talk about gentrification. And I know whatever, coffee shops, places to drink, whatever. But there's new housing. There's that project that's going to replace those blue homes of housing that's there, that John Price development. And you're seeing, when you talk about less Latinos, fewer Mexican Americans, fewer Black people, you can see it on Haley. Because if you grew up here and you were here 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the culture of that street is entirely different. So I know, I know what you're saying in that regard. And then Milpas, the fear is like, that's the next place that's going to get gentrified, in terms of, we have that big apartment housing project that's coming in, and that's those rents are going to be really expensive. So, we're sort of seeing all of that, even on the west side too. And one of the things that, a lot of people come into town and they don't realize the history, and they want to go sort of like change everything, or they want to say how things should be. And this is a tech community, and we want young people to walk downtown and be able to, ride their bikes, and all that's great. But they don't really understand, like, there's already a community here. We don't need you to bring your tech community here and change what we do. And I think that's part of the complex conversation that we're having. And a lot of people just don't understand that. How were you able to stay here, Frank? You grew up here, and how are you still here?
So part of I moved back after I want to go do my BA over at UCLA, and got my master's over at UT Austin. And after that, moved back because my mom was still over here, and wanted to support, and come back to the mobile home park I had grown up in, which is Nomad Village, over here by the El Sueño exit, and squished between the 154. So yeah, I think it's those family networks, definitely. And I think, and cause, definitely. I was looking for jobs in Los Angeles, and here in cause came up, and it was just perfect to be able to bring that labor union, electoral community organizing that I had done throughout Southern California and in Texas back over here. But before I continue with that question, thank you for elevating, I think, especially Haley Street, because, yeah, I think that one is just, you definitely see what gentrification kind of is in fruition. And diving into the history of or just the story of Santa Barbara and Haley Street, and really looking at these kind of, especially at that time, or continue to be like those Black venues that were throughout Haley Street, that were safe spaces for people of color, then became and are safe places for immigrant communities, especially as we get into the 70s, 80s, 90s. And yeah, you could, and definitely it was a rougher area that a lot of, especially white community, were not going to, not all of them, but it was considered kind of the rougher area. And so it's like, how do we have those conversations of what all that language meant, and what it now means, where we have Haley Street that, yeah, like you're saying, it has a lot more kind of coffee shops and spot, that when it used to have a lot more kind of clubs and EOs that used to be Diamante, that used to be other venues that a lot of our parents went to dancing. And I think that is where I think I've seen, especially the drop in the Latino population, is just thinking of those dance venues where we used to have Alex's and Diamante and different spots in Galita and over here that were dedicated places, that now it's kind of more of a Latino night or whatever it's called at a certain venue. So you definitely see like that investment in terms of properties and where people were dancing. Those were also lost here. And I think one of the ones in Upper State Street, I'm blanking on the name, I know you know of it, but on Upper State Street, that dance venue that was up there, that one closed down as well. And I know that one has switched from different owners, but that used to be a very important kind of Latino dance hall as well. So getting back to why I think I was able to stay here, it's kind of those networks, being able to work here, but also I definitely, I was a Santa Barbara kid, you know, like I love skating and biking to work. This is one of the, I know, best places to do that compared to when I was biking to go to work from Boyle Heights to South LA. Sometimes it was rough, you know, in terms of what environment can give you. And I mean, I'm a big public transport and skating and biking human. So stuff like that, and being close to the beach, but being one of those people that really never goes to the beach, like inside the water. I'm more of like, oh, cool, I'm biking next to the beach kind of human. So there's a lot of things that pull me back this way, mostly family, a lot of dope family that I love and appreciate. And it's not the easiest thing. And so there are some protections, especially for mobile homeowners, right? In terms of the rent we pay, and it's more stabilized because it's state regulated. So I know that has supported tremendously as well. So, but at the end, like for a lot of folks, were both my parents were, my pops is back in Mexico, has been back since like 2012, but he grew up working the service industry here, mostly 30 years over at La Cumbre Country Club. Crazy to say those time periods. He was there for a long time. And my mom has been cleaning houses and taking care of folks at their houses her whole life, or her whole kind of working adult life here. Folks that do those service economies are super important. And I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, we felt how important it was, especially that human kind of connection and contact that you have from the service industry here. And you know, you're hearing, you know, Radio Bronco or one of those in the kitchens here, right? As you go to eat. So it's just kind of, how do we make sure those folks that are the ones that are making sure we have the best food, that we have the best service, that we have such a dope place to live, be able to live where they work and comfortably. And so we know this is a complicated conversation, and we know this is part of another conversation, right? This is just, rent stabilization is part of the solution for long-term housing security. We know we need more places for folks to live. I think it's one of the questions you had raised in terms of we're going to have new property and older property. And the thing is right now it's kind of just a free for all. And we can't have these skyrocketing rents be across the board because it's where the service economy worker is going to work at. And so hence why we went hard on really elevating this and really elevating this for the Santa Barbara East Side and West Side, because these are the pockets. And I think we've been pretty explicit in like, we do want to protect these pockets because this is where a lot of our immigrant and working class and rental community live. But what is changing, and that's what we're trying to decipher a lot from the census, is folks are moving around Santa Barbara, right? These areas that were maybe a little more, not as much maybe immigrant or people of color population are now living in other parts of Santa Barbara that we wouldn't think of, right? Because we know those pockets right now, a little bit like Alamar over by Oak Park. We're thinking about still the Milpas and San Andres corridors, but places in more towards where I live over here by behind the McDonald's in Upper State Street, there's a lot of apartments and a lot of immigrant community. So we know it's a complicated conversation. We know there's a lot of ideas and it's a contentious issue because it is a big decision for a municipality to take. So I think we're really taking the momentum of Oxnard and what they've done over in our neighboring county and hoping we can see and continue these conversations to see something like that coming to fruition here in Santa Barbara.
Great. And I want to be respectful of your time. One more minute, Frank. You had a demonstration, Delegate Plaza. Just to wrap up here, talk to the city council. You know, why do they need to make the right decision here when it comes to rent stabilization?
Yeah, and that action is, we've been talking to council members, and throughout this time, we've definitely, like we talked about right now, we're focusing on those council members that we know will support us, and really try to make sure they get all the facts in terms of everything we've been talking about, but also those learning moments of kind of with Oxnard in terms of the cost of the program and looking at all that. And our leaders really wanted to do an action and have been wanting to do one because it's been a while since the last meeting. And hearing that this is going to be the first time City Council was in City Hall together, the leaders wanted to protest outside of City Hall. And I think as of late, as one of the deciding votes, Councilmember Alejandra Gutierrez, we've definitely been kind of putting pressure in terms of making sure they get all the right information, just so they have all the info to make the right decision. And I think that it was how cause works. We have Junta Grandes, which is really meeting at people's houses, using that motto of the United Farm Workers, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, in terms of building that connection and building up to an action. And so we just had a Junta Grande over actually at Ledbetter Beach that our organizer Wendy Santa Maria organized, which was awesome. And the leaders all of them were at the action that day to really one, bring up those stories that I've been talking about, like with the mold, with the lack of habitability, and making sure we have the right protections. So our goal is to make sure that the council members have all the right information, but also have the stories of why we need this to be implemented. And so, I mean, it was kind of perfect timing. Now the rent stabilization vote is coming back this Tuesday. And so we're excited to have the conversation continue, and hopefully we get to have this super important safety net to protect renters and the broader community here in Santa Barbara.
Great. Well, thank you, Frank. Really great conversation. I appreciate you educating me and the audience on these complex issues. And just, personally, you are very inspirational. You're doing real work in the community. You're not a spotlight seeker. You just do things, you get things done. And this is the latest example of your efforts, causes efforts. So, I just want to say, great work, regardless of where this stands, you're a role model for a lot of people in terms of how to be civic minded in your community. So thank you for your time.
Very kind words, and I appreciate that, Josh. And Great talking to you.
All right, take care.